Welcome back to the Monocle, where we keep an eye on Dynasty football. On tonight's episode, we're going to be doing a listener mailbag, and basically just covering. We have some questions about Aaron Jones. We have who else? We have Travis Kelce, C.D. Lamb. I mean, quite a few big name guys that maybe have some question marks, like that kind of thing. So we're going to be covering all that. Obviously, if anyone has any other questions they want to hop into the chat and do that, that's great. Hop in, send us the questions. We'll go over those as well. First, I want to bring on my co-host Nubs. How you doing, bud?
Hey man, it's been good. This week's we got a lot of snow. I actually was doing some snow blowing a couple days ago, and basically it was up to the top of the blower. So it's a nice day out in the weather for probably a good hour and a half.
Yeah, that's funny because I was telling you earlier, or I sent the picture earlier today that it was 82 degrees today in Florida. So you're dealing with snow. I'm over here sweating my butt off at work, and it's definitely two different worlds over here.
Well, and the thing is, you can't let it sit because when it sits over like 24 hours and it's cold enough, everything gets really hard and really tough. So you have to attack it in the first 24 hours, or it's twice as difficult and it takes twice as long, and it's not as good of a job either way.
I've actually heard if it's hard and tough for 24 hours that you actually have to go to the doctor for that.
Well, I had a doctor that made house calls before I started snowballing on time, and he was charging way too much, so I had to stop.
Oh man, we took it too far. All right, so we just actually literally this morning we wrapped up our Harry Potter draft, which we kind of discussed on Twitter. We really haven't talked about it too much on here, but basically we have a Harry Potter draft, Harry Potter League. It was an auction draft, and it has a lot of bonuses. It has a lot of special scoring, which I wrote an article. It's up on contenderconnection.com. Talking about the special scoring that we did for this league, and I honestly think that it will be the scoring that I implement on any new leagues, or at least something very similar, because I love it. We've been following the scoring for a lot of the players in the playoffs, and just paying attention to what it will be, and I love it. I don't know how you feel, Nubs, if you're as excited about it as I am, but I love that it's different at the very least.
I can appreciate that it's different. I do. I like playing Superflex more than single QB, obviously. So what happens with this scoring is it's adjusted for quarterbacks that aren't just for volume, but for actual great production on the field. So I appreciate that much. I do like the fact too that we were able to work together as a league to determine if we needed to kind of make any sort of minor changes so that quarterbacks that don't take risks don't get rewarded the same way that quarterbacks that do and actually succeed by taking those risks. So I like that. I don't know. I think this is going to be a good league. This is the one league I actually appreciate having divisions, because we ended up turning them into houses, and it's just a great idea. And I'm on Slytherin, which is the team I wanted to be on, which was the house I wanted to be in. So I'm happy about that as well. So we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, it is very interesting, and I even said in the group chat, it's funny how we've been trying to get rid of divisions for years, and then we make a new league, the first league of the year in 2021, and the first thing we do is implement 4 divisions. But the way that it works, if you're a dork like us, if you're a nerd like us, then you know all about Harry Potter, and you know how there's the 4 houses, Slytherin, Ravenclaw, Hufflepuff, and Gryffindor, and so there's a whole, we could get into it. We could probably do an entire pod, and maybe we'll do an entire pod. We'll actually be discussing it tomorrow night on our first roundtable pod, where we're going to have a lot of guys from Contender Connection, all the writers, and obviously the podcasters and everything. Duchesne's, Aaron Wilcox, myself, Nubs, Dave Fantasy, Blocking the Back, and we might even have Nathan Dearset. I'm not sure if he's going to be able to make it or not, but it's going to be great. Most of them are involved in the league, and we're all just going to be kind of going over our strategies, how we feel about the scoring, how we feel about our teams, all that kind of stuff. But real quick, I just wanted to ask you, Tim, how are you feeling about your team? Because like I said, we just wrapped it up. It's finally time to sit down and start making trades and moves and figuring out what we need in the draft and all that kind of stuff.
I'm feeling pretty good about my team. It starts 12, so there's a lot that we can look at for how you want to build it, as well as it's one QB, one running back, one tight end, one wide receiver, and a bunch of flex, and then a super flex. So it gives you a lot of ways in which you can manipulate your lineup or the players that you choose. I thought I had gotten good top end players. Actually, I wasn't. I ended up getting Chubb and Kamara, but I wasn't even planning on getting either one of them. But I tried to bid to set the price, and it ended up being that no one outbid me, and I really liked the price that I got them at. So wasn't upset about that at all. And I feel like I also was able to acquire some good some good bench pieces that could turn into good depth for just minimum bids. And I think I spent a total of like $13 on my tight end position, and I'm in love with the players I got. I got Troutman, Gronk for a year, upside with Herdman. I'm trying to think who else I have for tight end. They have two more, but I can't remember who. Oh, Disley and
did you get Oliver
and Sternberger? I did not get Oliver. I got outbid on Oliver, unfortunately. So I don't have the guy that's most owned on most of my teams. But I think there's some upside. The one player I got though that I question if I paid too much is that I got Chris Godwin, which I don't even think I overpaid for him, but just based on the other receivers that went off the board later, I feel like I could have gotten 2 or 3 of them for the same price that I paid for Godwin, and would give me a little bit more depth. But I feel like I'm buying Godwin on the season he had, and not like the prior production or even hype that he had. So it might be a post type, not sleeper, but a discount that I'm getting on him, and I'm pretty happy about that. I didn't see what Duchesne had said. Would you mind repeating what he had added to our chat?
Oh yeah. Duchesne said it hurt letting you get both Chubb and Kamara, and then Omega said it's a nasty combo, and I can't believe they didn't let you get Oliver, because everyone knows how you feel about your $5 Oliver.
Okay, so a little backstory. I actually, in our prior startup last year, had nominated Oliver, and Block in the Back Ryan decided to get into a little bit of bidding war with me. I ended up stopping where he ended up getting him for $5, but it wasn't a bidding war I expected to be in, nor one I wanted to be in.
5 out of 500. So I mean, it's still not as much, but for Josh Oliver, it's still probably $4 too much. So, oh man, that's funny. I kind of felt the same way. There were some players that I guess I was trying to like price police on and stuff like that I ended up with. But I don't feel like I actually overpaid for anyone when it was all said and done. I'm perfectly happy with my team, and having we're obviously going to go more in detail, more in depth tomorrow night. But I have some studs. I have Ridley, I have Dalvin Cook, I have Julio, I have Keenan Allen, I have Derrick Henry, but I also have the 103 and the 104. So I'm sitting pretty with some picks that I can work with whatever I need to there, whether I want QB, running back, wide receiver, all that kind of good stuff. So pretty excited. I'm excited to talk about it tomorrow night, but we're here tonight to talk about your questions and to answer your questions. So why don't we go ahead and dive into those? And the first question is from @FF Superflex Guru, and Trey said, "What do you guys think about Aaron Jones? A lot of people are selling him off, but what if he lands in a good landing spot like Buffalo?" The first thing is, I'm not sure that I agree that Buffalo is actually a great landing spot. I don't know how you feel about that, Tim, but I mean, we've seen this year that, I mean, maybe you can say like a better talent like Jones is going to go in and be a workhorse, but I don't see workhorse when I actually see Jones. So what do you think of the actual landing spot of Buffalo before we like dive into the actual question?
Well, Buffalo wasn't good at run blocking anyway this year. So are we expecting them to completely change? Is it the kind of the same situation when we're looking at, or maybe more of an opposite when we're looking at kind of like how Seattle's offensive line was for years, where they just couldn't pass block, or they could run block efficiently enough to have a supporting running back? Something else too, if we're looking at it, maybe a complimentary back is just better for who's ever next to Josh Allen, because if you have to draw up plays for Jones, let's say he gets there, it could have an impact on the way that Allen's able to play more freely in a less free or more restricted environment, which could hurt him. Obviously, if you're going to bring him in, you're going to pay him a lot of money. You're going to expect to use him. But I don't know. I'm with you. I'm not sure. I think based on points scored, Buffalo's a better than average or better than some other situations as an environment for him to go to. I just don't know if it's actually a good landing spot, like you said.
Yeah, I agree, and we'll probably do a whole pod on Buffalo and everything that's going to be going on with that team this year during the off season. But that was just one of the first thing I wanted to touch on. Honestly, I've been a fan of Jones since he came into the league. He was a fifth round pick. I loved him. I drafted him in a couple spots, and I didn't have nearly as many dynasty teams at the time, so it's not like I can't say like I drafted him in like 20 spots or anything like that. But I did draft him in a couple. But then just you could see the coaches saw something where they were like, we can't give this guy 25 touches a game. He can't be the workhorse. And it really didn't happen for him until LaFleur took over. And even then, he's still not getting 20, 25 touches a game. He's getting his 16, 18 touches, like that kind of thing. He's still doing like about a 50-50 split. Now, he's doing really, really well with it, but he's also in a very efficient offense. So what happens when he goes to not as efficient of an offense? And, now you can make the argument that Buffalo is about the same or better or whatever, but I wouldn't make that argument. And I definitely wouldn't think, when you get into the goal line or near the goal line that it's going to be the same as what it's been with Green Bay. And then the other thing is really just the price. Like if you look at Jones' price right now, his ADP, it's running back 15, which I really have no issues with whatsoever. But if you look at his overall ADP, it's 42nd overall. And I was looking at some of the guys around there, and I just don't really feel comfortable. He honestly feels about 20 spots too high for me, like at least 15 spots too high for me, because there would be some wide receivers and maybe even a tight end or two that I'd probably end up taking over Jones, or there's probably even a couple running backs, because obviously we talked about how Joe Mixon is running back 19 on the last pod, and I would take Mixon over Jones, maybe even just for the age difference more than anything else.
Totally fair. Can you believe the Mixon's only 24 still? Just nuts.
Even I know that I said it on the pod last week. It still doesn't sound right.
Yeah, it's just nuts. I agree with you in a lot of cases. The one thing I said, it really depends on two factors. It depends on one, what are you expecting from him? Are you trading or acquiring Aaron Jones in a fashion that you're expecting running back one numbers again? And I don't think that's fair to do that, especially if he leaves. Now, he signed with Rosenhaus, so I think he wants max money, which I expect a fifth-round pick to want to do. So you kind of limit your options about who's actually going to send you an offer, who's going to try to make a deal with you. So that could even impact your landing spot even more, where you're restricted to a lot fewer options that may not even be best suited for you to reach your ceiling or your potential, as well as how much does he cost? So if the person that's selling him is selling him because they're worried or have read a bunch about get out of Jones as soon as possible, that's one thing. But if it's a guy who's holding true that he was the running back one this year, he was consistent the year prior as well, I don't really see a deal getting done on my end to try to acquire him. Now, I just finished up a startup and I did draft Aaron Jones. I got him at running back 19 and I got him at pick 41. But there were a lot of running backs picked before, and I really believe there's like a top 22 or top 21 running backs that you really want. And I'll take Jones as potential RB2, because even if I review back the draft that I had, there were only 6 running backs taken in the next 4.5 rounds in that draft after I took Jones. Only 6. One of them was A.J. Dillon 2 rounds after I picked Jones, which was then 2 rounds in front of the next pick, the next running back selected. So it was basically a 3.5 round blank canvas for an A.J. Dillon selection. Going back to Jones, but I think it's different if you're also trying to acquire in a startup versus in a trade, because you can kind of look at the trends, kind of determine where the backs are coming off, who's already got some backs. Can I make a move up a little bit and take them if I need them, things like that. That's important. But then versus making a trade for them in a league that's already established, it's going to be very weighed heavily on who your trade partner is and what their team looks like. If they're trying to move them to kind of reset versus they're making a push and they want one of your better players or something of that nature, that's going to change it a lot as well. So I think there's a lot of factors in here, but I'm most likely staying away in many cases just based on the cost.
Yeah, and I agree with you. And obviously, that's kind of why I always try to stick to the ADP, or at least the ADP that we have, because every league's going to be different. I'm not saying don't try to trade for a guy. If you're already in a league, obviously, if this is more for startups, but you can kind of gauge the value. You can look at a list of 15 running backs or 40, 50 players and say, would I want this player over these 50 players, like that kind of thing. And then real quick, Omega asked, how old is Jones? Is he not 24? No, he just turned 26, but he is 26. So
And I think it's fair, just real quick, I think it's fair to use startup values in assessing trades. Obviously, it's not going to be perfect, but it gives you good perspective because in a vacuum, it really boils down to, would you take this player or this player? Obviously, your build could matter as you're drafting, but that's not what you're looking at. You're looking at ADPs. You're looking at who is your opportunity cost going to be by selecting Jones versus another player.
Yeah, and then the last thing I want to touch on with him was he's averaged 66 targets over the last 2 years. And, going back to Buffalo, Singletary had 50 targets this past year. Now, I mean, that's not a huge difference, but you're still just talking about going from here to here to here to here. And, there's obviously no guarantees depending on where he ends up. But I do feel like, and you're closer to the Packers than I am, or you probably pay a little more attention to him. But I just, at this point, I really do feel like there's like a 20% chance of him going back to the Packers. Like, it seems like he's going to be on a new team, and you have to bring that, like everything being up in the air into question, and you have to put that into his value.
Yeah, and Jamal Williams is his deal's up too. There's a lot of fluidity in this backfield this offseason. I think the smartest thing would be for the Packers to let him test free agency, find out what his market value is, and then make a determination if they want to continue with that or not. Which I put it at like a 15% he's coming back at best, just because I think he's going to want money, and I don't blame him for it. But it doesn't make sense, and I don't think it's feasible to re-sign him at the deal he wants.
This is also why I went and got AJ Dillon in like at least half of my leagues at his third round tender, his third round price, and I got him pretty cheap. So I'm pretty happy about that. I actually did buy him a little bit more expensive more recently, but I feel like the upside's there and definitely worth it. And you might still be able to get him cheap because there are still question marks there, but there's also a lot of hype, so I don't know. At Rom Clem asked a couple of questions for us as well. He's a part of the happy hour chat. He's actually in the Harry Potter league as well, so that'll be fun. He is our number one Lithuanian fan, so we love our Lithuanian boys and everything. So shout out Lithuania. But his first question is, how do you value rookie picks for like 21, 22, 23? Like basically, like how do you value future rookie picks, and and basically what to do with them? And so I'll let you start this one off.
I like acquiring rookie picks as much as anyone. I really like future first too, but it's going to really have to depend on a few things because every single draft, every single year, the hype is going to increase as we get closer into rookie draft time. We know this. So that's just something that we can expect every year. The different degree of hype and the different degree of overblown value will change throughout each draft class. That's something to consider as well. I kind of looked at this question in a couple of different ways. One is if you're making a trade and acquiring future picks, or just how you're supposed to look at them. I kind of looked at it both ways. So when I'm talking about acquiring them or making trades with involving them, I think it has to make sense that the trade partner you have has to be realistic with their values of the future picks. Whether it be them trading them away to acquire one of your actual players right now, they have to understand that there's a drop in value due to it being a future pick, especially if you're in a rookie draft. If I have let's say 105, I have to understand the time it takes for me to regain that value back that I'm pretty much giving away for 2 years and just kind of putting a hold on it. It has to be within that sort of frame. My idea about it is that in a lot of cases, you kind of drop those picks around in value when you're making a trade or kind of discussing a trade. where if you're getting a first, and this really depends on the draft class as well, because you have to set your draft board up, your ranks and your tiers in a way that you feel comfortable enough to be able to plan ahead or make decisions. Where if you're looking at the 101 or 102 this year, or even the 103, 104, depending on what your opinion is, the value of those picks is going to be higher than the value of the next, 4 to 8. So even if you're trading, let's say 102 for a 108 and a future first, that may not be enough, or it may be enough depending on what your draft board looks like. So that's something to kind of understand. A lot of us are not going to have the same values. I had discussed a trade for 101, and I was told that I was crazy, but I'm trading for future picks. And these future picks, I'm going to have to wait. I'm going to have to even get to a point in which I like a prospect as much as I like Lawrence at 101. And then I have to determine what I might get at the other first that I was looking at is worth it, which to me, unless you're paying this price, I don't think it's worth it. So when you're looking at 21, 22, 23, if you're okay with waiting and being patient, you're going to recover that value at some point, but it's going to be more of a productive struggle, or I have a term for it I like to call it. I call it winning thin. If you're trying to win thin, or if you're just completely rebuilding, it'll be a completely different aspect. But those are just aces in your back pocket once those years come up. If you can kind of withstand the storm and move forward without whatever assets you gave up. But like I said, the valuation has to be correct. They have to really understand that the values of these picks, if they're trading them away, are depreciated at this point before they've even appreciated.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there. And, the obvious answer, and you kind of touched on it, is, the closer the pick is, the more valuable it is. Especially with 21 picks, we actually know what they are. So that, that makes even more of a difference, because, saying a 23 first doesn't necessarily mean anything. It could literally be 112. It could be 101. But what I will add is, I feel like, certain players, obviously every player is different, everything like that, but I feel like you can accumulate when you're talking about picks. Obviously it's not just 2023 picks, but talking about picks that are 2 years in the future, you can usually acquire multiples. If somebody happens to have 223 first, they're going to give you multiples to get a deal done now. And like you said, if you're willing to be patient, if you're willing to build your team slow, win thin, whatever you want to call it, do the productive struggle, then you can build a super team. And, little backstory, this is why Rom's probably asking the question, because he just took over an orphan in one of our leagues. And he just traded a bunch of people, and now he has, I believe, 623 firsts. And he has some 22 firsts as well. And then I don't know if he has any 21 firsts or not, but regardless, he has a lot of firsts, a lot of picks, not just first, coming up pretty soon, or at least in the next 2 years. And, he's going to be able to do a lot with that. It's just going to take time. But that was also what needed to be done with that team. That team had to be blown up. There was no fixing it. There was no going and getting one player or two players or something like that. So, it's just, you have to do what you have to do. But sometimes it can be easier when you're talking about 2 years out. Just be like, hey, instead of 22 second, how about you throw that 23 first in? And people are, oh yeah, that's 2 years in the future. I don't care. And then 2 years later, it's 103. And you're like, yeah, it took a while, but I have 103 now, and then you're sitting pretty.
And it could depend too on the depth of your team. Where let's say you have an Aaron Jones, who's maybe your third or fourth running back, because you have a deep team, and you move him for a couple, later, or not later, but future picks, and maybe it's a future first, future second, or two future first, something like that. It gives you the ability then for your roster to grow organically, while having all of that value just kind of acquiring in the background. Something else too, when you move a lot of players like Rom did, it gives you the opportunity to take risks. I'm not saying to take risks on older players or anything like that, because you'll still need to recoup value on them at some point with a trade partner. It could be that you end up taking a bunch of draft picks and you spin them up in the third round or something of that nature, and you're just kind of looking for one or two hits, which could then help build that foundation at a very cheap rate while it's still, accumulating those picks and things of that nature, because he got a ton of value for Josh Allen. He originally got like 2 firsts, a second, and Terry McLaurin. And then I traded for McLaurin, and I gave him 2 seconds and a first. So he got basically three or four first and 4 seconds or something like that for Allen. They might be at different years, but it's I would say he didn't do a bad job recouping value.
No, and obviously Allen's very, very important or very pricey at this point, so he, very well should have gotten all those picks. But the other thing I want to touch on before we get to his second question was for the actual classes themselves. Talking to Duchesne's, talking to Aaron Wilcox on the Devi pod, and obviously listening to other pods, a lot of people are talking about how the 21 class is great. Not so much for running backs, but for wide receivers, obviously quarterbacks, especially, and then even some tight ends. Then the 22 class is supposed to not be very good, at least not compared to the 21 class. But then the 23 class is supposed to be spectacular. And while that's all fine and dandy, I feel like if you start getting more and more hype of like the 22 class isn't good, it isn't good, isn't good, it might be good to attack that class and try to accumulate as many picks as you possibly can from that class at a discount, because there's always going to be good players. I don't care if the class isn't good, as long as you're good or at least somewhat good at drafting. If you can accumulate multiple picks, you're going to have a much better chance of getting that, at least that one or two studs. And now you're helping your team because somebody was like, "Oh, I don't want any 22 picks because that class sucks."
Well, in this upcoming college football season is going to be big for probably about 4 or 5 quarterbacks. Where if you're playing Superflex, having those picks can be very valuable. And I think there's a lot of fluidity that's, like I said, that's coming up with these players in this next 22 season, and we could see a great improvement or a decline. We don't know at this point. And not even just drafting players, but managing your picks. You could acquire all these 22 picks, and you just pick the players you want, and you're able to trade those other picks for value or future picks, things of that nature. So just having them creates that opportunity for value. We're going to talk about some a player or position, excuse me, later on. And something that I was talking about was limiting your trade partners, where if you pigeonhole yourself into a specific player or position, you may limit your trade partners. You can't do that with draft picks because everyone has their rankings are different, their draft boards are different. Someone's going to want those picks. Someone's going to be able to trade for those picks.
Definitely. So that brings us to his second question, and it's actually an interesting one because when he first posed the question, I was like, why did he bring up these two receivers? And then I remembered back to last year during the rookie drafts, and they were actually going like right behind each other, and like right next to each other. And it's so funny, just the value drop for one of them is just crazy to me. And I kind of completely forgot that they were actually valued pretty similarly. But it's how do you properly value CeeDee Lamb and Jerry Jeudy, and was there anything in the rookie years that really worries you about them? And honestly, like the kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier, like the first thing for me is going to be their prices. And right now, Lamb is going as wide receiver 8 and 29th overall, and Judy's going as wide receiver 22 and 68th overall. So that right there shows you like what I was talking about. They were being drafted right next to each other, and now there's a huge drop for Judy. And I was never the biggest Judy fan, just because I like certain receivers, including CD, over him. When it was at the draft. But I also kind of, the more I dive in, it really seems like Judy's price is right around where I would probably have him. It might be a little bit lower, but it's not that far off. Whereas Lamb's price at wide receiver 8 just seems way too high for me. When you actually look at it, Judy actually had a higher target share with 21.5% compared to CD's 17.8%. But, like the biggest thing for Judy was his true catch rate is kind of alarming at 73.2%, which was 103rd in the league for wide receivers, while Lamb's was at 85.1%, which was at 57th. Not amazing, but much better, obviously, than Judy's. And if you actually look at his actual catch rate, Judy's, that is, he was at 47%, which is just bad. I mean, you obviously want your wide receivers to catch more than half of the balls thrown their way. The problem is, can we blame Judy? Are we blaming Locke? There's a lot up in the air, and we don't know if it's because of, or if they're going to be replacing Locke. We don't know if Locke is going to improve. There's a lot in up in the air because of that, but I don't feel like they were that far off as far as like actual production efficiency, like things like that.
I'm a little bit different than you are. I truly believe that CD Lamb is going to be an alpha, and I think if we look at, I don't want to say just the DAC games because I don't think that's fair because we see players that mature, develop a little bit over the season, they learn things. So I don't really want to look at the body of work or the numbers particularly at this juncture. But when I look at CD, I see a lot of his targets they come so easily, and obviously he makes those really acrobatic touchdown catches, twisting the wrong way and looking over a different shoulder and all that other stuff. So from what I'm seeing is that in the game plan, they're manufacturing touches kind of the same way that McCarthy did for Devontae Adams. Now, I don't want to make that comparison because I don't think they're the same player, but I do think that CD will get to the level of alpha and top 12 receiver. At wide receiver 8, I think until he's proven anything of that level, he's at his ceiling in terms of price. So I'm most likely out just because I like acquiring assets that have a chance to grow. Obviously, CD does, but there's a risk that he doesn't. So that's for one. For two, I actually think Judy's too high. Not always just because of Judy, though, because I think Judy's coming into the draft last year. I thought Judy was one of the most intelligent players at receiver. He may not have been the best at every physical trait or attribute or whatever you want to call it, but I thought he was one of the smartest ones in the draft. He just has very good intelligence, both against his corner and running his routes, things like that. So I know there's potential there. But at wide receiver 22, I'm moving him and another piece to upgrade to whoever wide receiver 15 or 16 is. I'm doing that every time because I think he's more a wide receiver 30 based on a couple factors. We don't know who the quarterback's going to be. Sutton's coming back. Sutton was my sell on our first pod that I was ever on because I said there were factors outside of his control that may end up being an issue for him to reach his level of production the year prior or even improve from that level. I could see the same thing with Judy, with Patrick and Sutton and Judy, Fant, Albert O potentially being something. We don't know how that running game is going to progress because that offensive line did play well this year for the running game. So there's all these factors that could contribute negatively to Judy's actual production next year that I could see his wide receiver rank drop even more, especially with this new draft class coming in. As we just compared to the old draft class, there were a bunch of second round wide receivers that ended up gaining value and proving that they're worthwhile picks. We could see the same thing this year, and he could easily be wide receiver 30 or lower, even before the season starts. So there's just what do you say? Those options. Just seeing if there's anything else to look at to add.
Well, I just wanted to say real quick,
Yeah.
I do agree with you. This I would have CD higher. I'm not saying like I would have them, around the same. It was just more I don't like CD's price at 8 and Judy's price at 22. I feel like they should be a little closer, but I also feel like Judy is probably a little too high. I just don't feel like he's like crazy high compared to where he's at. Whereas I do kind of feel that way with CD. But one of the things is with one of the metrics that I really have fallen in love with this year is the yards per team pass attempt, and it's kind of like it's a useful efficiency metric, especially in like within your own team. And so it doesn't matter if you're. It doesn't really matter if you're, if you're good, or it only matters if you're good. It doesn't necessarily matter if everyone else is good around you or anything like that. And they were pretty close. Judy was at 1.39 and Lamb was at 1.51 yards per team pass attempt. So obviously we know that they both had QB issues. We know that the offenses sputtered for both teams and stuff like that. But when you look at it, like they were very similarly efficient. Where Lamb was a little bit better. So that's why I'm saying like they should be a little closer regardless of where you end up having them in their rankings. Like they should just be a little bit closer. It shouldn't be a 14 wide receiver difference.
I don't feel that way. We're gonna have to disagree on this one, John.
Hey, there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
I just and once again, the question was based off of those two players. So I wasn't really even comparing them to other players necessarily. It was really just more comparing them to themselves,
Mm-hmm.
But that's going to bring us to our third question, and it is from the X. 209, he asked, "Are you spending up for tight end this year after seeing how big of a gap there was between Kelsey, Waller, and then the rest of the tight ends?" And so I'll let you start this one off.
It's just so much against the way I like to play Dynasty to buy tight ends. I'm one that wants to acquire a group and then sell off the good ones when I can, acquire value that matches at least what I think the next risk should be. I was discussing recently a trade for moving one of my tight ends for 203. Now, 203 is a decent draft pick. There's going to be potential guys there to take risks on, most likely a wide receiver. But I was trading. It was Hunter Henry I was discussing, which he was tight end 12 this year in the league. I have him in settings, and it was consistent. You think another year with Herbert, nothing wrong with that. He had a bunch of double-digit scoring as well, but it's just kind of like I'll give up that potential consistent floor and kind of predictable ceiling for a risk at another position, and then try to have that appreciate more because once again, I don't want to limit myself to one market. I had a comparison with Mark Andrews. Now, I am a big Andrews fan. I think that he's one of the tight ends that has solidified his role in the offense. And like they even traded away Hurst because they knew who their tight end was. And I think that's valuable. But once again, where do we value him at? Are we valuing him at the 108? If someone said he's worth the 108, does the owner of Andrews make that trade for the 108? Is the 108 potentially a Javonte Williams or maybe an ETN or even I'm gonna forget his name right now, the Alabama wide receiver, Devontae Smith?
Oh,
Is he one of those
you
guys?
think Smith's going to 8?
Well, I think his potential with I think 4 quarterbacks go in the top 7 or 8. I really do. So all those things are we saying that he's worth either or any of those guys? Because if Javonte Williams goes to, let's say, Pittsburgh, which I think is a really interesting fit, I think he's a top 20 running back to start if he starts, as the running back in that backfield. So there's all these things because I think your market's a lot more varied when it comes to people wanting running backs versus a specific tight end. So I just don't like paying up that way because you're just, once again, limiting your market. And unless that player consistently produces, and as we see here, we're talking about Waller and we're talking about Kelsey. We're talking about 2 tight ends. That means that basically the rest of the league either didn't have an advantage or had to make sure they picked the right tight end for their lineup, which is still an opportunity or possibility that occurs. So I don't see like so many teams having like the positional advantage on you that really hurts you in the long run. Because the team that has Kelsey, yes, they have an advantage. The team that has Waller, as we see, he gets the volume of targets to give him an advantage as well. But is the rest of their lineup good enough? Have they paid up to acquire him where they've actually limited their resources, where they actually aren't that good of a team anymore, where you might not even see them in the playoffs, things like that. So I just don't want to limit my market when I'm making deals like that.
Yeah, I can see that. And for this one especially, it seems like it's kind of like two different arguments. Whereas if these tight ends are already on somebody's team, they're probably going to cost more to acquire. Whereas once again, I'm looking at the ADP for startup ADP and like that kind of thing. And in a startup, it's probably a lot easier to get these tight ends because I was looking at some of the ADP and I really thought I was going to be completely out, especially on some of these players. And then I started looking at it and who was going around them. And I was like, this isn't too bad. And, we'll get into those in a minute, but obviously we got to touch on Kelsey first. I don't know if it just hasn't caught up, and maybe if like he just blows up again in the Super Bowl, maybe it'll be much worse in February ADP. But Kelsey's ADP right now is at oh man, I thought I wrote it down, but it was in the 30, like low 30s. It was like 32 or something like that. Still going behind George Kittle. And that is just blowing my mind right now. He was like 6 spots behind George Kittle. George Kittle, that has been hurt every single year, every single season, has had like just about every injury you could possibly have, and obviously has a higher chance of re-injury for those specific injuries because of already having those injuries. And we've talked about it before on multiple pods about how it's his play style. So I don't understand why George Kittle is going 6 spots ahead of Kelsey, but then again, Kelsey going in the 30s in a startup, I'm taking that all day long. I have no issues with his age. I have no issues with his health, obviously, and I would definitely take that. Whereas I kind of thought, and like I said, this might be the ADP just hasn't caught up yet, but I kind of thought he was going to be almost untouchable at this point, and I was going to be out. But then, yeah, so like these are guys that are going around Kelsey right now. You have Josh Jacobs, George Kittle, Antonio Gibson, and Jalen Hurts. That's just four guys. Obviously, there's a lot more, but like I would take Kelsey over any of those guys. And so it just seems like he at the very least is a few spots. But when you're talking about those first 20 or so picks, a few spots can make a pretty big difference.
In my startup recently, it's tight end premium. Someone took Kelsey at 112 and Kittle at 201.
Oh wow. Okay. Yeah, I mean I could see it with the tight end
Crazy.
premium, but yeah, it is crazy. But I can see it. I can see it. Going with some of the other guys that are a little bit later in the draft, like if you don't end up with a Kelsey, and this is where I was saying like some of these middle or like second, third, fourth, and fifth tight ends, like I actually thought I was going to be completely out on them, but I went and looked at their prices. And Waller, Andrews, and Hawkinson actually seem to be kind of in like a dead zone of the draft where I really don't like too many of the players right there, whether it be age, whether it be roster construction, or just players that I just generally don't like, whatever it might be. And so I'm not saying that they're absolute steals at those prices or anything like that, but it just depending on how you've built your team, depending on how you're taking your team, they're not terrible prices either, and I would at least consider them. They're going Waller, Andrews, and Hawkinson are going as the 63rd, 66th, and 76th overall players.
Yeah, I say that's fair value for sure.
Yeah, so like I get what you're saying. Obviously trading for them is going to be completely different because you're not going to. No one's going to give you 66th overall prices for Andrews if they're on, if they're on his their team, if he's on their team, I should say, and especially not Duchesne's. But in a startup, you definitely can do this. But we're kind of getting into startup season. Obviously, we just got done talking about how we're doing a startup, and we'll probably be doing another one after that. So that's why we're giving you both options.
We can only hope we create another league. I love startups. Ugh.
I know we just have to figure out what the next theme's going to be, and all the crazy bonuses and all that kind of stuff we're going to be doing for that one.
I'd love to do a Back to the Future one. Just throwing that out there.
Ooh, okay, we got to start brainstorming on that one.
No, I think
I
we have
bet
a
there's
we
a
have
lot
like
we
a
can
few
do.
more questions, but I know that we wanted to see if we got any questions from anyone watching. So as we continue, just if you have any questions, just feel free to throw them in chat.
Yeah, absolutely. What? Obviously, not start sit questions because we can't do that.
I say
But yeah,
sit them
that
all.
brings
Sit them
sit
all.
them all, sit them all. Especially this week. Next week we got a different story, but FF Spaceman asked, "What adjustments are you making in your rookie process due to no combine, shortened seasons in college, opt outs, and other COVID-related issues?" And this is going to be kind of going back to the Debbie Pod, Debbie Devotional. We've touched on this at least a little bit. Myself, Duchesne's, and Aaron Wilcox. We've kind of talked about how it's going to be one of the most important years for watching film. Whether you do it or whether you trust somebody else to do it, or whether you subscribe to a service to do it, however you want to do it, watching film is probably going to be more important than ever because you need to be able to come up with your actual like a full answer on these players. And if you're just looking at the numbers for 2020, it could be tough because we don't know if they were playing against a team that had a bunch of COVID players, missing, whether they had a bunch of opt outs, regardless of whatever the excuse is, we don't know the full story. And so, whereas I feel like in a normal year, you can get a very good idea of what a player is, who a player is with the numbers. This year, the film is definitely going to be very, very important.
I was reading your notes before I put mine in, and I liked one thing you said because this is how I've always treated it, and this is where just for fantasy, this is only my struggle for fantasy when talking analytics, is that I like to look at players as individuals. I understand looking at historical data and making the comparisons because, like, if you're doing something in business, or if you're looking at, you know, even poker EV stuff, you're going to look at it with a very analytical viewpoint. But I still like to consider the human element that we're looking at when we're looking at these players. So I prefer film in a lot of these cases anyway. I do understand or appreciate the analytics because I've made this statement that I believe that there may be times where analytics is a lot more accurate in predicting who's going to score the points versus who's good, because you may not even have to be good to score the fantasy points. So that's a big difference. Um, but when it comes to evaluating rookie prospects, I really lean film because I look for traits. I look for specific things I think that are able to transfer over from their college play to the NFL, or different ways in which they can be used in an offense. Like, I was huge on Brandon Ayuk, not saying he was my number one wide receiver or anything like that, but I really liked what I saw from him because he's not the same player, but he had a lot of elements that I liked comparatively to Keenan Allen. Now, I don't like making player comparisons that way because then you make an expectation he's gonna get to that level. But when he has the ball in his hands, or when he's somewhat downfield, he was able to do a lot of crazy things, but he did them all very, very smoothly, and that was where I saw the kind of the trait working its way through. So that's just a comparison when we're talking the individual. Now, with analytics, it helps you comb through data quickly to try to identify players you may not have even evaluated yet, or it can be helpful to kind of confirm a position you had on a player through film. Something else I said is I really don't believe the 40 matters anyway, in most cases, besides maybe running backs, because it can confirm what you see on film one way or another. Like, if you watched any film on Devin Singletary, you were never surprised he ran a 4.6. Ever surprised. You were not one time where you're like, oh man, how did he run so slow? Well, if you watched him play any snap ball, you would have known that going to him. So I don't really believe that there's that much value in it. So when it comes to the combine, it was always used, in my opinion, to really, once again, confirm my thoughts on a player versus open up Pandora's box of, oh, hey, well, we got to relook at this guy. No, you either have already done the homework or you haven't. If you haven't, then you at least have a kind of a kick in the pants to go look at this guy. But it shouldn't be anywhere in where you're confirming opinions anyway. So I don't think we're missing out too much when we're looking at combine stuff. As well, lastly, I think what your builds look like will make a difference in the risk taking that you go out and make. For example, this year is going to be a lot of opportunity to draft wide receivers in the second round that could end up being large producers in fantasy. So are you more willing to trade back from a player that many think are or will be kind of a locked in running back one or wide receiver one or something of that nature to take these risks on these players? Or do you want that more confirmed or safer prospect to add to an already stacked lineup, or to complete a lineup maybe? So those are things you're going to have to consider while also evaluating these players. But I don't think your process should change too much. You maybe want to be more in tune to more sources and a variety of sources to make your decisions.
Yeah, and obviously we're gonna have to wait and see on the combine. We obviously know that the actual combine itself isn't happening, but they're supposed to be doing kind of like a regulated pro day throughout the country, and so we'll have to kind of wait and see how regulated it is, how normalized it is throughout all these different pro days. Because if everything's completely different, then how much can you trust it? You might be able to, and once again. That's kind of one of the things I hate throwing out certain things, but I feel like this year might be the year where you have to kind of pick and choose which stats you actually look at if you are looking at the numbers. And honestly, even with the film, once again, if you're going up against, if a player's going up against a team where their best corner opted out, and now they're playing against the second best corner that's nowhere close to being nearly as good and that kind of thing. Can you really use that film and say, oh, he dominated them? Like, you might be able to look at it and say, okay, he did this right, but you kind of have to pick and choose, that kind of thing. But I definitely think with the combine, we just have to kind of wait and see on that. And then The only other thing is, we also touched on this on the Debbie devotional, which was basically it might be kind of important to look at the 2019 stuff, whether it's stats, film, metrics, whatever. 2019 might become very important. And once again, that is kind of like you have to be kind of cautious with that because sometimes it takes until 2020 to break out, and sometimes you need that extra year for a player and everything. Sometimes, especially if they're really young, just because they didn't break out until 2020, well, maybe they were 19 years old in 2019 or something like that. So there's a lot to take in. If anything, I feel like we're just going to have to do more work this year. And obviously, we're going to do it here on the podcast. We're going to try and do as much as we possibly can so that you guys don't have to do anything but listen. And but when it comes down to actually like drafting these players and everything, it's probably going to have to it's going to take some extra work, some extra time.
Yeah,
But
you just have to identify which sources you trust most, and then work with those, or use those as maybe your true north, and then kind of go off at your own angle from there.
yeah, and obviously, we're coming up on, a lot of people are getting vaccines right now and everything, but we're also now football doesn't technically start for, what, 8 months. So, I don't know if we're going to have to worry about it or not, but I guess I kind of always just assumed last year, oh, well, it's going to be a 2020 thing and then it'll be over and all that kind of stuff. But at this point, it seems like we're already messing up the combine, things are already starting to get messed up for this season. And so I wonder if if it might mess with the season, again next year going into the actual NFL season or the preseason and stuff like that. And that's gonna suck, but I guess at this point it might actually just be a reality that we have to deal with.
How much are you going to trust these 40 times if they're from different sources all over the country?
I'm with you. I really don't care about 40 times. I feel like it's one of the least like predictive or like least important stats or metrics that you could look at. In fact, if anything, I almost feel like when people look at 40 times that they usually end up being wrong because they're like, oh my God, this guy runs a 4.38. He's going to be a badass. Like Darius Slayton, I think he runs a 4.38, something like that. He's not that good. He's just not that good at football. And so, yeah, he runs fast. That's great. But you have to actually be good at football. You have to be able to catch the ball. Chase Claypool's really fast. He's not that good at football. He's better than Slayton, but still, it just I actually I feel like I'm totally with you on that one, and I don't even look at 40 times. In fact, we always kind of joke in the happy hour chat about the bars on Player Profiler, and I love that website. There's a lot of information to glean from that website. But if you're just looking at the bars on Player Profiler, you're doing it wrong.
You just reminded me. I had a player profiler bullet point, and I didn't even say it. And I'm wondering what it was.
Well, go back while you're doing that. Chief fan wanted to know what are some statistical categories that you pay attention to more than others. Obviously, it depends on what position you're talking about and all that kind of stuff. But target share, market share for wide receivers is very important. Dominator rating is obviously important. It's basically just saying, like, were you very important in your own offense? That kind of thing. For running backs, looking at burst, like the burst score, the 40 time really isn't important at all as long as you kind of meet a threshold. If you're out there running a 5.1 40 or something like that, then I probably don't want you on my team. But as long as you're running like a 4.65 or something, or hopefully better, but like kind of like a men, then yeah, I'm okay with the 40 times. But yeah, I mean, there's a burst scores, obviously important. Same thing, college dominators, very important for running backs. Were they getting all the touches? Were they splitting time? Weight, BMI, people are going to hate me for saying that, but BMI is important when you're talking about an actual workhorse back, because there's not, and BMI is more important than weight, because there's workhorse backs that are 208 pounds, and then there's workhorse backs that are 230 pounds, and then there's Derrick Henry, and you know what? Derrick Henry actually has a lower BMI than some of these other guys, but just talking about the actual like size of the player, I'm not too worried about him. He's an outlier. But like generally speaking, you're looking kind of like for that higher BMI. I want to say, what is it, like 28 and above, something like that.
The analytics community may look at this differently when it comes to college numbers, but I don't care about yards per carry at all. I think it's the worst stat to look at for any sort of one predictability as well as when you're talking efficiency, because that could be so many factors like offensive line, whatever else. But when it comes to rookies prospects, I agree it's shuttles and like the first 10 for running backs. But I do like to know what the 40 times are, as well as I actually really like to watch them to see how they run. But very few times in the game are you going to get to that speed. But I like to know that you're capable of it because it maybe changes what I expect your ceiling or think your ceiling could be. That being said, though, there are very few times you get to that speed because you might be going in 5 yard, 7 yard bursts at most, or hoping to break one. And most running backs cannot run corners anyway. So don't look at that as like the most negative thing ever. There are a ton of running backs that could get caught from behind. So I would say that's probably the least important thing when it comes to looking at a running back. Vision's way more important. Patience is way more important. Things like that.
Yeah, I mean, look at David Montgomery. You know, he's kind of like the new hotness after the way he finished the season and everything. And yet, I mean, he'll get run down on a 20-yard run. You know, like, you could literally, you'll actually have like a defensive lineman, you know, catching him on some of these runs and everything. But you know, he's shifty and whatever you want to call it, he's elusive. So you know, that's more important than 40 times and things like that. But you know, we could probably break down a lot of that stuff on like an actual pod dedicated to it. But those are a couple that I look at, you know. But I think just dominating your own team as far as like touches, snap percentage, like stuff like that is probably one of the most important because if you're a part-time player in college, there's a good chance you're going to be a part-time player in the NFL.
I think that's right too. No, I don't like dominating as much as you do because I think it's convoluted. I think there's other metrics that do the same thing but aren't as busy. But that's true because of the fact that in college the objective is to get the ball to your best players. Now you may have a team like Alabama that spreads it to a bunch of really good players, but like in the case of even ETN, there's a lot of times where they're throwing the ball behind the line of scrimmage just to get the ball into his hands because they know he's better than most of their other players. He's also better than most of the people on defense. So the manufacturing of touches is important as well. I agree with you that share does matter.
Yeah, and it's never going to be perfect. You're always going to miss players regardless and that kind of thing. But you know, just one thing that just one player, one example that's popped into my head was Henry Ruggs. You know, Henry Ruggs did not have a good college dominator. He didn't have a great college target share, and yet he went in the first round. So people started falling in love with them, taking him at the end of the first round in rookie drafts or the beginning of the second round. And then guess what? I mean, it's early. He's only 1 year in, all that kind of stuff. But he did not look very good. He was not targeted heavily in the NFL, just like he was in college. There was players like Devontae Smith. There was players like Jerry Jeudy that were just better than Henry Ruggs, and so they stood out, and he didn't. And you know, that's just kind of one example. It's not going to be perfect. You know, it's not like you can just say, "Oh, just because it worked with Ruggs, it's going to work with everyone else." But that's just kind of a reason why we like to look at stuff like dominator rating and everything. But that was a really good question, and honestly, I appreciate everyone's questions. Hopefully, we answered them to the best of our abilities, and we helped you guys out a little bit. We are going to be doing that first roundtable pod tomorrow night, and we'll be streaming that, and we'll putting that out to all Apple Pods and Google Pods and Spotify and all that kind of stuff as well. And then obviously we'll be back with the Monocle pod next Wednesday. But for now, we're cashing out.